Okay, I think we can start. Welcome all to the third in the series of webinars being hosted by the Warwick Research Center for International Development. WICID, as we call it, is spearheaded by Professor Shireen Rai and offers a whole range of programs on inequality and global change. We hope that you will check it out and that we will grow with your support. This webinar has been organized by the Critical South Asia group that I convene at the University of Warwick. We are a collective of faculty and research students who do research on South Asia and are committed to bringing critical and activist questions to our academic concerns. So far, we have organized two very stimulating discussions on COVID-19 and South Asia, one on journeying with migrant labor and the second on citizenship matters. Recordings of these sessions are available on the WICID website in case you missed those sessions and are interested. Today, we are looking at the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic has been gendered. By that, we mean to look at the crucial effects of the pandemic on women and sexual minorities throughout South Asia, but also to discuss how gender ideologies shape the production and management of the crisis in specific ways. I'm delighted to say that once again, we have a fantastic panel of discussants who we hope will help us explore this subject, which of course generally gets elided in both media and policy discussions. So on the panel are Asha Abeyeskera from the University of Colombo, Sarah Hussain, who's a lawyer and is part of the Bangladesh Legal Aid and Service Trust in Bangladesh, Nida Kirmani from the University of Lahore, Kavita Krishnan, who's from the All India Progressive Women's Association, and Shilpa Phadke from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. So with those very brief introductions to panelists who have very extensive and very impressive CVs, but in this age of the internet, I will not go into further details. I will just go ahead and invite our first panelist, Asha, to offer her reflections on this topic. Each of you has 5 to 7 minutes to speak in the first round. We will then take it to discussion, questions and answers, and then come back to all of you in the concluding minutes of this discussion. So welcome to all of you, and welcome, Asha. You can take the floor now.
Thank you, Rashmi. So my reflections on the gendered impact of COVID-19 in Sri Lanka will focus on two key things. One being sort of how the island-wide curfew, which was imposed on 20th March and was only lifted towards the end of May, had a profound impact on domestic space and intimate relations. I want to reflect on how the intersection of relational and spatial dynamics of being confined in the home, specifically to the extent to which it reinforced gender roles and the gender division of labor for women, and more critically, brought into focus a fundamental assumption of the curfew lockdown, which is that home is a safe haven for women. And my second point would focus on the impact of the COVID-19 lockdown on women in the workforce, and specifically women working in the free trade zones in Sri Lanka. And if I have time, or maybe in the question and answer, touch on domestic workers as well. So a quick background. Once the second patient was detected, Sri Lanka went into imposing curfew on the 17th of March. And by the 20th of March, there was island-wide curfew imposed. Now, unlike in the rest of South Asia, this meant that we could not step out of the house. There was no leaving the house, even to buy groceries. Within the week, there were suppliers coming down to streets and actually giving provisions, selling provisions. So there was no, except for essential workers, there was nobody else who was allowed to step outside the house. And this went on till the end of May, with Colombo and a few other districts that had the highest number of cases, um, having sort of without any kind of break, almost 6 to 7 weeks of lockdown. So 20th of March is when the full lockdown happened. And on the 22nd of March, just 2 days later, the chief nursing officer of the Colombo National Hospital on her Facebook page reported that there was an increase in the number of domestic violence cases being admitted to the accident ward. Now, she said that on a daily basis, there was about 275 to 285 cases into the accident service, and out of which only about 5 to 10 cases were incidents of like victims of domestic violence. The numbers have drastically dropped because of the lockdown to about 80, between 60 and 80, and she claimed that almost 40 to 50 of the cases that were now coming in had to do with domestic violence. So very soon after the lockdown, there were many national helplines that were either set up or reactivated. So these had to do with, specifically to do with COVID-19, the emergency helplines, domestic violence helplines that had been set up at the Ministry of Women, mental health helplines. So they were all activated across the island. And all of them were reporting that there were the incidence of domestic violence seems to be going up, at least if not the incidence, and the reporting, a majority of the calls that were coming in had to do with domestic violence. And women's rights organizations or NGOs and CBOs working in sort of the villages and districts at the district level were also beginning to provide information that they were getting calls from their community members and members that there was a high incidence of domestic violence. Women in Need, which is a national NGO working on violence against women, also reported that between the 16th of March and 1st of April, their calls had increased up to 250. So Sri Lanka actually has a high baseline for incidents of gender-based violence. For instance, in 2018, the police received an average of 60 calls per day. The Demographic and Health Survey of 2016 reports that at least 1 in 5 women had experienced some form of gender-based violence in the past year. So we don't have the statistics yet to see whether this has been a phenomenal increase, but definitely the reporting increased during the lockdown. So while the helplines have been active, there is really very little that could be done other than answering the helplines. If police were contacted, their response was mainly that there was a bigger emergency going on and there was nothing really now that they could do. And one of the ways in which the children and women's help desks work in the police station is they first try to resolve the issue by sort of de-escalating the problem by telling women or the husband or the wife to kind of go and stay a few days with their families and come back, which was now not possible. Some of them would sort of spend some time with neighbors or family members, and now that was really the social support and temporary relief that was available for victims was now not possible because of the lockdown, the very strict lockdown. So legal support where you could sort of bring a stay order also obviously was not possible because the courts had also ceased activity. So apart from this information, the mental health helplines were also reporting from sort of more middle class demographic that there were calls that were coming in where sexual coercion and emotional abuse in the home had increased at this time. The stress of financial difficulties and the interpersonal dynamics of kind of staying at home for all this time with family members, especially your spouse, your husband, that had created a lot of tension in the house. So a lot of it had to do with the fact that clearly there was now the gender roles in the home clearly kind of demarcated. I mean, it's hardwired in any case across the classes, but this was now exacerbated because people were not going out to work. Women were expected to now cook all meals, 2 to 3 meals for their families. There was no takeout. Household chores, cleaning, laundry were now had to be done by the women. So in middle class homes, of course, domestic workers could not come to work. So that burden was also borne by then the mother or the wife. And what happened at this time is that very quickly the school system responded by introducing online schooling to students. So there's sort of varying levels at which this was accessible, depending on what kind of school you attended, private, public. But what then happened was people were really, women were talking about what a burden that was, because now they had not only their housework, and in case of sort of women who worked from home, they were working from home and then having to monitor their children's schooling as well. So this is not unique to Sri Lanka, but this is something that was highlighted at this time. And because also the fact that the provisions were being coming in, there was also this added task of keeping an eye out for the trucks that were kind of circling around your neighborhoods. So, women formed these WhatsApp networks where somebody would stay out to kind of catch the provision trucks that would be driving by to ensure that they had enough supplies for the house. So once the shutdown began to ease and there was a gradual returning to work, one of the key things that came out across the classes also was that although people were being asked to come back to work, which was towards the end of May, they were now left with this problem of children being at home. And how do we now, they were schooling, so what can now be done? Because the children need to be managed at home, and women needed to go back into the workforce as well. So this was really kind of a very serious dilemma that women were talking about. So let me move on to my next point, which is about the impact on the apparel industry within the free trade zones. And this was one of where actually the free trade zone has something between sort of 200 to 300,000 workers, of which 80% are women. It was one of the hardest hit industries because it depends on markets in Europe and the US. And what happened as soon as the shutdown was announced is that all the factories closed down. And immediately there were all these workers who live in boardings and hostels in the free trade zones now stuck with nowhere to get back home. Some of them actually had no home to go to. They lived in hostels. But now they were sort of stuck in these small rooms. Some of them were single mothers. Sometime in April, the government announced that these factories should open and that these workers were considered essential workers. But what had happened, of course, is because of the very quick downturn in orders, a lot of the smaller factories had already shut down. So the shutdown happened 20th of March. By the first week of April, workers were already complaining to the NGOs that work with them that they had not been paid their March salary as yet. Some of them now were being called back to work, but they had not received their pay for March. They were too worried about not returning because they would lose their job. In any case, women who had only worked who had worked for less than a year and women who were over 50 who were working in the apparel industry were asked their work was terminated. A lot of them were asked to voluntarily resign. And many factories, women in factories were complaining that they, for about 2 to 3 weeks, they worked without pay. Um, One of the key things that happened at that time was that you get retirement benefits paid, called EPF, ETF, which was not getting paid, and very quickly the companies had actually asked the labor department for a moratorium of 6 months not to pay these benefits. So that was then another major concern for these workers. Surrounding this issue was the condition of the hostels, which has been an ongoing problem in Sri Lanka, that sort of these very small spaces with very little hygiene standards, that these workers were now quite frightened about living in these in their homes because without being able to go out. The government introduced a scheme where they were distributing 5,000 rupees to the sort of the poorest people who had lost jobs and had absolutely no income. But how it affected the free trade zone workers is these are not women. A majority of them are not people who are from the free trade zone district. They're from different parts of the island. If you are not then registered with the Grama Niladhari as a resident, which they're not recognized as residents of that area, then they're not eligible for this 5,000 rupees or the bag of goods that was being distributed by the government. So even though, so there were many interviews that came out where the Gram Nilda was saying, my hands are tied because I'm not allowed to give the 5,000 rupees to you because you're not a resident. And this affected especially women, women who, single mothers who are living in the free trade zones. There were really sort of quite sad videos that were being posted by NGOs with women saying, we don't have anything to feed our children with. And that was, definitely there were some NGOs that came in and helped some of them, but this was definitely sort of a real problem that affected the women. Now the situation is that women have been, women who work in the para industry have been asked to come back to work. They've been given strict instructions that they are now having to work 7 days a week. Overtime that's paid for Sundays, and what we have is a Poya holiday, which is the full moon day, which is a holiday, where they got overtime that they were not going to be paid that. And so women are kind of faced with this dilemma of do they keep the job under these conditions, because they really have no other choice if they need an income. And for those who went back to their villages, most families rely on this income. So the kind of dynamics in the family where there is a woman coming back now without the ability to contribute to the family, again, anecdotal evidence, of course, is causing tension within the family. So I'll stop there and maybe address other issues during the question and answer.
Okay. Thank you so much, Asha, for your contribution. I think it really shows the ways in which the pandemic is recalibrating the home work, division, and so acutely felt in the Sri Lankan context as well. So yeah, okay, let's hear Sarah now, and I'm sure we'll all come back and have questions for you as well. Yeah, Sarah.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Rashmi. I think I'll focus mostly on the situation in terms of justice, but just maybe give you some general comments before that regarding the situation in Bangladesh. We also were closed from about late March, 26th of March, but in a kind of a sui generis way, we declared a general holiday rather than a lockdown. And that meant there was a bit of confusion about what should happen. There was an immediate rush out of Dhaka city for people to go back to their village homes, which is what happens when there's a general holiday. And the public transport was only shut down more than a day after the general holiday was announced. So there was a big, there was a big move, and obviously a huge opportunity for further infection. That general holiday finally has been called off as of the 15th of June. And now there's a different approach of having zones, red, orange, and green zones. And in red zones, there's a kind of total lockdown, no offices, very limited, almost no movement. And in green zones, you can still move around. Schools are still closed. Of course, factories, offices were all closed during this time until the 15th of June. And we still have a kind of, not a hard curfew like Sri Lanka's, but basically we're not supposed to have movement between 8 at night to dawn every day. The situation in terms of deaths and infections, we have about over 1 lakh of infections currently, about 119,198 today, and the number of deaths is standing at about 1,500. Interestingly, in terms of and the highest incidence is in Dhaka, then Chittagong, which is perhaps what we'd expect, the two biggest metro cities, Dhaka the biggest by far. In terms of understanding how it's impacting women, the WHO and government data shows that about 70% of the total reported confirmed cases are male, and 79% of the total reported deaths are also men. But in terms of the age and gender data, it's only, according to WHO, it's only available for 24% of the reported confirmed cases. And of course, we don't have any disaggregated data in terms of marginalized communities. So it's not possible to work out who's being impacted how. We can only do it by location, which is what the information is coming through in terms of. After the general holiday was declared, quite soon after that, there've been a series of different government directives. Again, the framework within which this has happened is quite interesting. That we haven't had a state of emergency, but we haven't also declared a disaster under our Disaster Management Act. We have got a very recent bit of legislation, just 2 years old, in terms of epidemic control and response. And so the directives that are being issued seem to be being issued in relation to that legislation. That legislation doesn't have any measures, any provisions regarding protection of any person who's affected. So that's a kind of interesting gap and omission in the legislation, which is obviously having a huge impact in terms of how individuals are then treated. But in terms of the directives, one of the first things we saw was in the first few weeks and continuing, many hospitals would refuse to admit anyone who did have COVID. So then there were government circulars requiring hospitals, all hospitals, public and private, to set up protocols for admission and to ensure admission. But of course, refusals continued. These were challenged in court, and the High Court once it became operational, gave some strong directives. The government appealed that and has got those stayed. So that's the kind of the context in terms of treatment for COVID affected. There's a real issue also for people and there's real issues in terms of getting testing and where to go and still getting treatment and support. But there's also issues, I think, and particularly affecting women in terms of treatment for those who need healthcare for anything other than COVID. So I just give you an anecdotal example. Someone from our house needed to have a hysterectomy, and someone who used to work for us, and she lives in a small district town. She was told she couldn't have it without a COVID negative certificate. To get a COVID negative certificate, she has to be tested. There's only one testing center in that town, and there are massive queues, and she's in acute pain and couldn't be there. So she's got to decide either to travel into Dhaka in that situation where she'll be able to get a test more easily if she pays, or just to try and put the whole thing off. And that's just one tiny example sort of illustrating what's going on generally. I think the other sort of response immediately after was, of course, the stimulus package and the safety net measures that were announced. There were some very positive measures in there. So, for example, there were issues about that there was specific allocation in terms of women and women affected by violence. There were specific allocations for the Hijra community also. We saw, that those were differentially, I guess, implemented. There were many issues around corruption, which also obviously affected women in terms of the impact of distribution. We found NGOs also had to intervene in a lot of cases to ensure that actually, those genuinely affected could get onto the lists and weren't being pushed out through more sort of partisan measures that were being taken by the kind of political groups that were getting involved initially with this process. There were also very important measures announced for workers' pay to be covered by employers, and that the government would also pay for that up till the end of June. There have been huge issues with that, and I think also with the declaration of the general holiday, and probably all of you saw those pictures, not on the scale that you saw in India with migrant workers, but many of our garment factory workers walked their way back tens of miles to come back to the city in order to join work, because there was great confusion about whether workers or factories would continue to stay open even during the general holiday initially. And that happened. There were a couple of rounds of that kind of confusion, with people coming back, then being told they wouldn't work after all, then not being given their pay. And even today, there have been again exhortations from government calling on employers to ensure payments are made. And this is also tied up with much bigger issues where many of the big brands have refused to honor their commitments under existing contracts and pay the amounts that were due on contracts that had already been fulfilled. So now factory owners and employers are, using that also in some cases to avoid their obligations to pay. And in this context, we've also seen some women trade unionists and workers' organizations playing a really major role in terms of raising these issues. Interestingly, the head of our Government Employers Association is also a woman at this point, the first one ever. And we've seen some real kind of conflict, I would say, between her and between the trade union representatives speaking about workers' voices. So let me just get to, I'm sorry, I think I'm almost at the end of my time, but I just want to speak, the main issue I wanted to speak about actually was around the impact in terms of domestic violence. Can I just take a minute extra, Rashmi? Would that be okay? Sure, yeah. All right. Again, very similar, I think, to what we just heard from Sri Lanka as well. But in terms of the assumption is definitely that it's on the rise. The Manush Jane Foundation did a recent phone survey, and they've actually shown from their figures that there is a small rise, but they're showing the highest rises in terms of people reporting psychological violence. And in terms of service provision, they're showing that the direct services have plummeted down. So we can't provide legal services are only online, so there's a very limited amount that's being done. Advice services have massively gone up, but referrals, legal services, police support, all of that has kind of crashed at the bottom. And I think it's important to look at what's happening with domestic violence response pre-COVID compared to now. So even pre-COVID, it wasn't the situation that the majority of those facing either domestic violence or other forms of gender-based violence were getting into court. They definitely weren't. Only 2% of violence survivors actually even reported any incidents or sought any kind of assistance. So I think the strategy for service providers or responders was very much to see, how do you get advice to more people? So how do you get to that first space? And in that context now with COVID, not having people on the ground, not having our community volunteers or community health workers or paralegals, which there's a very strong network of in Bangladesh, not having them on the ground means when clients, potential clients and survivors and victims aren't able to reach the people they need to. So hotlines are working. There are government hotlines. There's a multi-sectoral violence against women program from the government that is running its hotlines. The police are running their hotlines. But the big gap is, and NGOs have hotlines too, but the big gap is once you get to the hotline, then what do you do? Obviously, there are very limited numbers of shelters. And again, even the shelters we had before that was not the first place women wanted to go. Basically, most cases, people want some kind of mediation or intervention within the family. In cases where they do go to court, the primary remedy people want, there are demands for protection orders, residence orders, but really much less under the Domestic Violence Act. It's much more common to have women asking for maintenance orders. And the big issue now is we've got virtual courts finally operational from a few weeks ago, but the virtual court does not extend to family courts. And it does, although magistrates are working, the magistrates' domestic violence jurisdiction doesn't seem to be activated either. And very critically, the government authorities that are the first point of contact in terms of domestic violence cases, which is enforcement officers again under the Women's Ministry, also don't seem to be activated or coordinated at all. So it's very interesting to see that in some places we've seen the changes, you know, the digital services, online services are coming on board. Everyone's aware of that. We have a lot of slogans about digital Bangladesh as well, of course. But in these, and we have very strong policies, which we had in place before COVID, around addressing violence against women, but they're not translating into this situation. So they're not finding, they're not being treated as priority areas at all. So women's groups are currently advocating for the police to accept electronic GDs, electronic complaints, because without that, they can't get into the rest of the multi-sectoral government services. They're advocating for women's desks to be, again, which are provided for under law, to be activated at police stations. Up till now, in many cases, police are saying we can't deal with this DV stuff or GBV stuff because we have too much COVID response to be doing, and we're frontline COVID responders. And women's groups are advocating for the virtual court jurisdiction to be expanded to DV cases and to family court cases in particular, and especially to expedite maintenance cases. And I think there's a real opportunity to rethink these issues in the context of digital services. Just a last point. I mean, in terms of, everyone has agreed that hotline services, online mental health responders and so on, all of this is now just a given. It's what everybody has to have, and everyone is transferring onto these platforms. And what we're not noticing, again, I think is, it was said from Sri Lanka, is that there is a massive digital divide. And in some cases, it's not just that that's a resource divide, it's a policy decision. So the worst example, I guess, the most kind of excruciating example of this we have is in the context of the Rohingya camps. So as you know, there are almost 1 million people, very large numbers of women who faced, extreme forms of gender-based violence when leaving Myanmar, and now are facing pervasive domestic violence as well. So there's no internet access. So in the Cox's Bazar, for whatever policy reason, and as a result, the hotlines can't be operational for one of the most vulnerable communities in the country. Let me just leave it there, I think, because I've gone a little bit over my time, and I'll add stuff later on when there's a chance. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. I think you added a really important dimension to our discussion, which is that of justice, of gender justice in the context of the unfolding pandemic. So I'm sure there's lots more to talk about, but I guess let's turn to Nida now for her reflections on this.
Thank you so much, Rashmi. And thanks for inviting me to this important seminar. I think Shilpa mentioned that the pandemic has, of course, introduced a whole range of constraints that we're talking about and exposed a lot of inequalities, especially in terms of gender. But the nice thing is that we're able to actually speak to each other. I guess we could have done this before, but we just never really thought about it. So all of a sudden we realized, oh, we can have conversations with our feminist colleagues and across these borders. And so that's just a wonderful thing. So I hope that carries on after the pandemic eventually ends. But yeah, I think I won't take up that much time. I think a lot of the issues that we heard about in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, and probably what we heard from India as well, are very similar in Pakistan. So I don't want to repeat things that others have said. I guess the governments of each of the countries are handling this maybe slightly differently, but there seems to be a lot of parallels with that as well. So Pakistan, the situation is very alarming, and our government has, like many governments, been in denial from the beginning. So there's a lot of misinformation. That's one of the reasons I felt a little unsure about even speaking on a panel about COVID, just because it's so hard to get clear information about what the situation is, whether it's regard to the numbers in general, but also the situation for women in particular. But as of today, there's about 186,000 cases reported in Pakistan. But we know that number is very, very low. It's a gross underestimation. So public health specialists have said that the number is probably at least 10 to 20 times more than that. But I don't know, because all you do is hear about cases every day. And so in a country of about 212 million, I think it is, 186,000 seems ridiculously low to me. So we can imagine it's much, much more. And a lot of people are not getting diagnosed, and the testing rate is very low. I think there's only been 1.1 million tests since the pandemic began, which is extremely low given the population of this country. So right now, Pakistan has one of the fastest growing rates of COVID in the world. It's I think in the top 10 according to the WHO. So it feels like you're just sitting in the ticking time bomb. But what's happened is they imposed not a very strict lockdown, but a lockdown that was varying in all of the provinces. So Sindh, where I'm sitting right now, probably had the strictest lockdown starting at the end of March. And I was in Punjab at that time at my university. And the lockdown there was not very strict, but businesses had shut down. And so we had the same kind of issues that we're seeing all over the world and all across the region in terms of the rising unemployment rate. Now, since a little bit before Eid, which was really the stupidest time to lift the lockdown, because that's the time when everyone would have wanted to go out and meet people and shop, and so they opened the markets, they opened the masjids, they opened everything up. And so then we started seeing a huge spike in the number of cases, unsurprisingly, a few weeks after that. And even still, we don't really have a lockdown right now. What Imran Khan's government is doing is repeatedly saying we have to impose a smart lockdown. And anytime I hear smart anything, I'm very skeptical. And from what we've seen, that means there's really no lockdown anywhere. They've just restricted the times that shops are open. And but we still have the problem of layoffs and unemployment. And of course, it's women who are being the hardest hit. So overall, I think there's a threat of about 15 to 20 million more people becoming jobless. And that's official numbers. And women's rate of employment in Pakistan is one of the lowest in the region. So it's about 26%. So that's already very low in terms of paid employment. And we know it's women who are always the ones who are first to be let go when there are layoffs. So a lot of women have been let go of their jobs if they were working in factories. Women are overrepresented as they are across the region in the informal sector. So a lot of those women have lost their sources of income. Over a quarter of Pakistani women have been fired or suspended from their jobs across various sectors. And so, the economic impact, like it is in all of the countries, has been really great for women, especially. In terms of unpaid work, again, this is the situation everywhere. Pakistan has a terrible rate of comparison between men and women in terms of the amount of unpaid labor that they do. So even before the pandemic, the number of hours that men spend, if a man spends 1 hour doing unpaid work in the household, a woman would spend 11 hours. So that is one of the worst rates in the world. And we know since the pandemic started, women's burden in terms of unpaid work has gone up. So there was a Gallup poll a few days ago, and women reported, 60% of the women reported that their burden of unpaid work somehow even went further up. And one can't really imagine, if you're already doing that much unpaid labor, how could you possibly do more? But they are doing more. And of course, we know one of the reasons is because now kids have not been going to school across the country, so a lot of that burden is falling on women. The ones who do have online classes, women are the ones who are having to supervise that work. So they're acting as mothers and as teachers, and of course doing all of the domestic work in the household as well. If we talk about education, today the students across the country have organized protests, and this makes me very nervous because pandemic times, but now I've been seeing over the last few weeks that we've started having protests again, physical protests outside. Part of me is of course, always supports the protests, whether it's workers' protests or students protesting. But then I'm also really worried because of the situation in terms of the virus. But hopefully they're practicing social distancing. The students are protesting because many universities, well, we went online in the end of March, and many universities will continue to stay online for the coming months. And there's a lot of parts of Pakistan that don't have internet access. So we were just hearing about the Rohingya community in Bangladesh not having internet access. In Pakistan, we have much of Balochistan doesn't have access to the internet, whether it's 3G or other kinds of Wi-Fi services. And the area that was formerly known as Fata and now has been integrated in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, a lot of those parts of the country don't have any kind of internet access. So this, of course, affects female and male students both. But of course, with young women, a lot of these guys are able to move to different places to be able to get access to 3G networks to be able to take their online classes. And young women and girls are not able to do this. So again, they're falling behind in terms of the education gap. So then we have the digital divide, which is there across the world and across the region. We have it in Pakistan as well. And I think this would apply to all of the countries. With so much of work and education now relying on the internet, the fact that such huge numbers of our population don't have access to the internet means that they're falling further behind, both in terms of employment and in terms of education. So we've heard female students complaining about that quite a bit. In terms of the health system, of course, like most countries, women are also, there's a high representation as compared to other sectors of women, both in terms of doctors and in terms of nurses. So there's been a lot of protests since the pandemic began that all health workers don't have access to PPE. So they didn't have any protective equipment. And of course, that meant that all of our health workers were more exposed to the virus. And we've had, of course, like most countries, a higher number of healthcare workers who've also contracted the virus and have higher death rates because of it. And women are particularly vulnerable because they are overrepresented. Nurses often don't get the PPE. It goes to the doctors, so there's a hierarchy within the hospitals as well. So it's nurses who are falling behind. There's been many protests amongst the healthcare workers as well since the pandemic began. Reproductive health services, of course, also have been suffering. They were pretty dire before, and now we again see that is one sector that's being neglected. Pre and postnatal services have discontinued in many parts of the country. There's so much that's happening. It's overwhelming, and it's also very, it's frustrating because we know that things are really bad, and then it's hard to know exactly what the situation is. So I'm sure in the coming months, we'll find out more what the impact of this pandemic has been on all of these various sectors. Care work, of course, within the home has gone up with so many people who have the virus, who aren't getting diagnosed. It's the women who are doing that care work. Our hospitals are already full to capacity. So that means a lot of people are not getting hospital beds. And we know that it's the women who are going to be caring for the sick people at home, as they always do. Today, I spoke to a friend of mine who works, who's a member of the Khwaja Sira community, we call the Hijra community in Pakistan, the transgender community, Khwaja Siras. And so she was telling me about how the Khwaja Sira community is suffering because of the pandemic as well. A lot of the members of that community who perhaps didn't engage in sex work before have been pushed into sex work because their other sources of income have dried up. So a lot of the members of the Khwaja Sira community would be invited, get their money during weddings or functions, other kinds of parties, or be invited in terms of entertainment, dancing. They're not able to do that kind of work anymore because this kind of partial lockdown situation that we have. So people aren't having the same level of parties and functions that they did, which is of course a good thing because we don't want the virus to spread, but it also means that their sources of income have dried up. So according to my friend who's working in the community, they were having to make this choice that we're hearing across the country and the region between starving and contracting the virus. And, because there's not a lot of information, people aren't even aware of the dangers of the virus. People are, demanding that the lockdown be raised and that all activities resume. There's been a huge amount of misinformation, and that's one of the reasons why people don't know the risks. That's why we don't see the kind of agitations for the the lockdown to be imposed. I mean, what somebody like myself would want and others have been arguing for is that there should be a very strict lockdown and a universal basic income should be introduced. And we can maybe talk about this later on in terms of what would be a kind of feminist solution to dealing with the kind of pandemic and what's actually happening in our respective countries. And certainly the solutions that have been proposed are not putting people's lives first. Of course, they're putting the economy first. And when they say economy, we know it only means certain people or certain groups within the economy. The government here did introduce something called the ESAS program, which was there before the pandemic began, but it's kind of social safety net, which we've seen in all of the countries. But the problem is you have to access it through a mobile phone, through mobile apps. So how many people actually would have access? They have dispersed a lot of money. I just looked, it was about 10 million people who received these funds. But again, 212 million people population, 10 million people have received these funds. So how many people are actually being supported? And this is money that's directed to women, and the transgender community also is eligible, but a lot of those folks don't have access to smartphones, so they're not able to actually gain their due in terms of the funds that have been allotted for them, and even that we know is not enough. So I'm going to stop there, and yeah, thank you so much. Hopefully we can come back to some of these points.
Thank you so much, Nida, and thanks for beginning to flag up the question of, because clearly there are these common themes which are emerging, space, work, justice, and so on. So I would also like to encourage all the people listening in, you can start sending in your questions even as, the panel is still going on, because we can already see a lot of common ground emerging. So with that, I would like to invite Kavita to speak next.
I couldn't. I lost some of what you said at the end. There's some connectivity problem. Yeah. Who did you ask to speak?
I asked the people who have. We have about.
No. Did you ask which speaker did you call to speak?
You.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I because that bit got lost.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Didn't reach. Yeah. Thank you. It was really important listening to all of the other speakers who've spoken till now, because as I think we are realizing, there are a lot of common grounds between the ways in which people have suffered during this whole pandemic in South Asian countries. And so there's a lot of themes which are similar, and in India also that is the case. But I'll just quickly try and, while flagging most of the important points, I'll try and also focus on some things which are sort of specific to India as well. And I'm sure Shilpa also will have a lot to say. So Sara and Shilpa are saying they can't hear me well and I'm breaking up or something. Is that the case? Just check that all is well. I'm going to continue speaking. Yeah. So I think in terms of the pandemic itself, I think that globally also what it has brought to the fore is what is essential work, right? Because it's absolutely clear that the CEOs are not the essential ones, and it's healthcare, it is people in the food and food distribution sector. These are those who are womaning the stores. They are the people, they are the workers who are actually essential. And yet we know from the experience of countries all over the world that they are the ones who are in the most vulnerable condition, without basic safety and without any income either. Most of them are in the informal sector, and they do not have either economic or social or health-wise protection. So that is a world, the COVID-19 has in a way shown a mirror to that world, and has thrown a challenge of recognizing that and saying we must change this world, right? Alongside that, of course, you also have the movement for justice in terms of, racial justice and so on, which we are seeing all over the world in terms of the Black Lives Matter protests, which also sort of makes the point that it is demanding a shift in terms of investment of public money from policing towards care of the community and from criminalization towards care. And I think that that is also something which the COVID-19 pandemic also threw up, that why are we spending money on, in the case of India, we are claiming to have enough money, lakhs and lakhs, hundreds of lakhs of rupees to squander away on a national register of citizens and to weed out, to strip people of citizenship. The government is claiming to have the funds for that, and they're having the funds for the kind of military situation that they are in on the people of Kashmir and the militarization in so many conflict areas, militarized policing, but they're not spending on basic healthcare and things that could actually protect ordinary people. That's what COVID-19 has shown us in India as well. The other situation is that, in India, you had, as in the other South Asian countries, but in India especially, it was a very brutal, sudden lockdown that was imposed without any prior planning, without any warning whatsoever. And that resulted in two things. One is that it could not really stop the spread of the pandemic, it could only delay it a little bit. And in effect, it could only protect those people who had homes and could lock themselves inside homes. So that would be the middle class and above. But for the poor, it meant that they were locked in to tiny homes and tiny communities where people are cramped up together, where water is not available, soap is not available. And so basically they were forcing those communities, those communities to spread the virus among themselves. That's what the lockdown ended up meaning. Also, what they did was that they attached the stigma to the virus by communalizing it, by linking it with Islamophobia. And that's something very specific to India. So they linked it with Islamophobia, and they said that this is a Muslim virus, and this is, China is the producer of the virus and Muslims are the distributor. And as a result of that stigma, they made it difficult not only for Muslims to come forward and report symptoms, but for everybody, because everyone began to feel that if we report symptoms, we become criminals and we are stigmatized. And so instead of encouraging people to be able to report what they were, so that they could then be given access to care and quarantine and so on, the opposite happened. So the result of that is being seen all over the country. It has spread. Literally, there has been clearly Modi's lockdown plan has failed. Now, the impact on women is that, of course, distancing is a privilege, and for women, in any case of the poor sections, it is that. Also, the access to healthcare in general, which others also flagged in the other countries, is all absolutely true in India as well. That for everything, health, and above all for pregnancy. So you had, these visual images of pregnant women having to be carried because no transport was made available, no healthcare access. No one bothered. What's going to happen to pregnant women who need to access a hospital or access and you can't reach? And there is no reckoning yet of how much maternal mortality or child mortality has increased in this. We can only reach because if you look at the UN former pandemic mortality, you realize that it will be high. And so you can only imagine, one can only guess, because Indian government is being very tight-fisted with data. They're not telling you anything, not about the COVID-19, not about anything. So you really don't have a way of knowing. Then the impact of the lockdown itself means that, and that's where I would suggest, when Nida said that we're demanding a stricter lockdown, I would say that instead of a lockdown in India, what we realized was that the top-down lockdown was really a major mess. That in fact, a community-led system, which Indian experts, public health experts recommended, would have been much better, which was not coercive, which was not draconian, which did not stigmatize those who fell sick, but instead offered care to everyone, that would have been much more effective. Now, what the pandemic has done, and the lockdown has done, is it's increased massive job losses, which in the Indian economy was already tanking, and now it is completely gone. And 90% of the total women workers in India, nearly 90%, are in the informal sector, which is the worst affected, where the migrant workers also, are in that segment. Also, the formal sectors of food production, hospitality, tourism, these are badly affected. And then sex workers and communities which are extremely marginalized, like homeless people, transgender people, these are extremely affected by the pandemic and the job losses. So their survival is at stake. And then when it comes to income losses also, there's been assessments that while income losses affect everyone, it is far more difficult for women to make up, even after the pandemic is gone, it will be difficult for them to actually come back to because they are already discriminated against. And then, of course, you have this whole unpaid care work situation. The essential workers in India, the sanitation workers, the nurses, and those who are called the ASHAs, who are basically rural health workers. These have been provided with no safety equipment, nothing, and they are being asked to basically shoulder the lion's share of the whole handling of this epidemic without any support whatsoever, and never mind pandemic. We have been demanding pandemic pay for them, but even that has not been forthcoming. Plus, because of the stigmatization, they've also been faced with being thrown out of rented accommodation and all kinds of discrimination. Rashmi, just give me a heads up when I have about a minute left, okay? So I'll appreciate that because I'm not kind of looking at my watch. And then, okay, so unpaid care work, of course, the burden of that has grown exponentially as it has everywhere. Access to water, access to food, nutrition, all these things. And just imagine the situation when people mention schools. So in India, a very large number of children, they basically get their midday meal in the schools. So the fact that the schools are shut means that midday meals are not happening. And while some states like Kerala have had a good record of providing those midday meals at homes, most of the other states have not done that. And Kerala is a state that, with all its problems, it is ruled by a left front government. I'm not saying that all is hunky-dory over there. I'm not romanticizing that, but I am saying that they did a better job of sort of really budgeting for the care that people would need, rather than resorting to coercion and stigma. The migration exodus, I just want to, I think people are familiar with that, but I just want to highlight one little thing there. This image that India became known for of Jyoti Paswan, the teenage girl 15-year-old girl who took her father on her cycle and took him home, cycling hundreds of kilometers from Gurgaon to Bihar. She became, in order to spin the whole story, you had everybody from Ivanka Trump to ministers in the Indian government trying to say, oh, what a Bahadur Beti she is, and she's very brave, and oh, it's her resilience, and okay, let's offer her a cycling federation, and a way to sort of maybe join the cycling federation and so on. And they offered her all that kind of rubbish. So they basically tried to turn what was an adversity that was forced on this young girl into some kind of image of, oh, bravery and resilience and this and that, which is complete bullshit. But it also tells you about the gendered story of how you are, how you're looking at the image of a young girl on her cycle, right? The fact that you have so much coercion and confinement in India, the fact that a girl as young as her will soon be in the workforce, desperate to somehow earn and support her family. What kind of work conditions are you going to give her? Are you going to allow her to study? You're not looking at any of this. And you are simply trying to spin this particularly horrific tale of her individual courage and take it as a badge of courage, a badge of honor for India and the Indian state. And then healthcare access, as I said, that's a mess. Discrimination, I mentioned. And when it comes to discrimination, see, this whole social distancing thing in India has played out very differently, because social distancing has become conflated with untouchability. So it has affected Dalit communities, including, of course, Dalit women. And also that untouchability model has been extended to Muslims. So social boycott of Muslim vendors, social boycott of Muslim women, pregnant Muslim women being denied a bed in a hospital, and so they have lost, children have died babies have died in childbirth because of this, and all of this. So these kinds of things have also happened. Domestic violence as others, I just wanted to add one more dimension to it, which is that confinement, I think in South Asia generally, but in India certainly, is something, and Shilpa will certainly say more about this, that confinement in general is a form of gender violence, and domestic violence, which is not recognized in India. So it may be coercive or it may not be, but basically it is, the expectation for girls and women to be confined at home. Now, there is an enforced confinement. So students have had to return home. And this has meant that you've had LGBTQ persons, like a trans girl, trans woman, committing suicide because her family began to force her to have conversion therapy. Likewise, women are, of course, at the receiving end of all kinds of domestic violence, and I mentioned that already, and the access to help in that situation is not there. Education-wise, and I want to flag this as important because it also ties up with what others have said, that look, this whole online exam business, just like in Pakistan, is a huge issue in India as well. Students are opposing it because internet access is not available. And this has resulted in Dalit girls committing suicide because they know that they will not be able to appear for an exam because they do not have access to a cell phone or they do not have access to the internet. Okay, now the last couple of points which I want to quickly flag. One is self-help groups, is that you have this whole microfinance or self-help groups model, which is supposed to be women's empowerment. Of course, what it is actually doing is that it is trapping women in a debt trap while making use of their disempowerment. So it is well known that policymakers in this direction say, oh, women can't run away, and so they'll have to repay loans. They're more susceptible to be shaming methods and so on. And so, they make good debtors. Now, in the context of the pandemic and the lockdown, there's been, my organization, the IPA, has had a lot of good response to protests organized, including real protests, not just virtual ones, physical protests by women who are in self-help groups or microfinance groups, because although the government has not waived the law, the government has said, okay, for 1 year, you won't have to pay installments. But that is also just on paper. And what is happening is that especially microfinance companies and so on are forcibly expropriating loans and are making use of the pandemic to do so without any consequences whatsoever. So they're coming to homes and literally, confiscating property and so on and so forth. So this protest actually received a very good response where we made various demands, which I can talk about later. And the last thing I wanted to flag is political violence. So political violence, I can't hear you, Rashmi, so I'm assuming that you're just telling me.
I said, yeah, your last point.
Yes, my last point, time is up. So political violence is that basically, this whole anti-CAA movement, against the Citizenship Act, which just preceded COVID-19 in India, that was a women-led movement. And in a way, the COVID-19 experience has vindicated that movement, because that was saying that, look, if you're going to demand documents as this thing for citizenship, the poor are going to get left out, not just Muslims, but the poor in general and women in particular, because in Assam, where documents were the basis for citizenship and NRC was conducted, 70% of those left out were women. And during COVID-19 also, this is the condition that people who have, ration cards, Aadhaar cards, etc., even they are not able to access rations which the government is promising because of all kinds of technicalities, or because they don't have paperwork, okay, or paperwork in one state is not working in the other, and so on. Now, what they're doing is they're also out using the COVID-19 pandemic time to arrest feminists. I'll leave it there and leave it for more. I can tell you more about this later, but jails are, of course, dangerous places right now for COVID-19. And so many feminist activists and Muslim women's activists have been jailed because they were active in the movement against the Citizenship Act. They are being criminalized, they're being jailed, they're being subjected to slut shaming in public.
Thank you so much, Kavita. I think your presentation really added another dimension, which is, I think, the whole sort of tension between state and community. So Kerala is a really good example of a state, providing a really good sort of infrastructure to dealing with the pandemic, and then community. I mean, when we think of caste and religious discrimination, what kind of a community, then can be turned to. So I'm sure, again, I hope we will be able to take up these questions as we go along. So finally, Shilpa, can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks so much, Rashmi, for inviting me to be part of this really exciting discussion. And I'm delighted to be here with scholars and activists whose work I admire. And I'm going to take off literally from where Kavita left off, in a sense. And I will focus on the lockdown and what it has meant for mobility and access to the public, where in the last 2 decades, the feminist discourse on gendered public space in India and in South Asia has evolved, sometimes dragging the mainstream narrative with it a little way, often kicking and screaming. I will focus on this discourse and the fluidity of the public-private divide as it relates to it in this pandemic. India is seen, as Kavita pointed out, what is widely recognized as the harshest lockdown in the world, pushing the more privileged citizens inside, those who could afford to be inside. As Kavita has already pointed out, the daily wage laborers and the migrants were the worst hit. What I want to focus on is this pressure to be inside the private space, when now you have this enemy, the enemy being this virus. But for women, of course, the outside, especially after dark, is something that has always been seen in many ways as threatening. And then women are urged to be inside, which, as Asha and others have pointed out, is implicitly seen as safe, despite the fact that across the world, the greatest proportion of assaults against women are committed in private spaces by persons known to them, even outside the pandemic. And in the pandemic, we are seeing, as all of the panelists have pointed out, a very, very particular gendering of the domestic, which, among other things, has also led to a rise in domestic violence. I will not dwell on this, but I do want to sort of recount one very creative response that I read about from the Pune district, which is that the Zilla Parishad in Pune decided to send men who are accused of domestic violence to institutional quarantine centers run by the district administration in an effort to flip the usual practice of sending women to shelter homes. And the thing they said to sort of buttress this was that, then women can be in the spaces that are familiar to them. And I think it's an interesting response and worth thinking about what an initiative like this might mean for claims to the home. Even where homes are safe from physical harm, again, as people have pointed out before me, women face an additional burden of care work. For those in paid employment, this means being available both domestically and professionally 24/7. And we've seen, even in relation to academia, that from what we are reading, globally, the numbers of papers being submitted by men have risen, but the same is not true for women academics, which is telling, right? So what are the politics of care when we, and what are the politics of a language of care when we say that men help in their own homes? What does it mean when the lockdown is used as a platform where jokes are being spread about men being stuck at home with their nagging wives? And this is very peculiarly middle class in a sense, the group that Kavita reflected on as being privileged and being inside. Again, to sort of add to what Kavita said and what Nida said in the Pakistani context, since 2005, in India, we've already seen a drop of women in the labor force. It has dropped from 35% to less than 24%. And as expected, the pandemic has only exacerbated this. Since education and employment historically have been among the most important ways in which women have sought equality, these losses pushing women back inside might have consequences that take us back decades. And this is something I think we need to reflect on and think about much more. Sort of expanding on what Kavita had already said about the protest. Just before the pandemic hit, we saw huge protests across the country against the Citizenship Amendment Act, an act passed in December 2019 that made religion, that is being Muslim specifically, the basis of discrimination. And we had thousands and tens of thousands of people across the country on the street protesting every day. So every day the conversation was, what's the protest? Are you going? How are you going? And universities across the country were up in arms. There were a growing number of sit-ins in the country, led mostly by women, often by Muslim women. Many had women on the front lines. And so some of you may have seen images of women sort of standing on the front lines of the protest with the men inside. A lot of this was in response perhaps to a law that no woman can be arrested after sunset and without the presence of a female constable. Many of these women protesters were visible and articulate, claiming the public as citizens with rights. And I think it's important to point this out, that here were these women, and I see a very, very clear link between the presence of these women and the expanding discourse of the public. The pandemic, however, has provided the state with an excuse to dismantle all of these. The protests were abruptly halted, the sit-ins were systematically broken up, and all signs of protest were erased. The most famous of these, the Shaheen Bagh in Delhi, had almost all of the amazing iconography and installations associated with it painted over. And so the state is engaged in a very, very concerted erasure of these protests. But at the same time, like Kavita pointed out, even as the pandemic continues, with number of cases rising every day, we have nowhere near flattened the curve. And like Nida said, in relation to Pakistan, we have no clear idea of what these numbers are. At the same time, the state is making use of this time to demolish environmental rights. They are inviting companies to bid for dense forests. At the same time, they are also arresting the democratic activists, particularly those associated with the protests. And this is particularly in relation to those who are protesting against the Citizenship Act, those who are inciting violence, in keeping with the political line of the government, have of course not been arrested at all. It's interesting also to note that two of these activists who have recently been arrested are from an organization called Pinjara Tod, an organization that began by campaigning for women's rights to the city and to safe, accessible and affordable housing. Just today, and people have been talking about sort of reproductive rights and pregnancy, the Delhi High Court has granted very, very sort of condescendingly granted bail to one protester, Safura Zargar, but making it very clear that they were doing this on quote unquote humanitarian grounds because she's pregnant and not on what they call merit. Okay, so I mean, there's this thing sort of hanging in the air. As a result of these very, very harsh lockdowns, we're in some ways pushed inside. We're writing open letters, we're mobilizing on online platforms, and our protests too have been pushed inside, as it were. But of course, the online is far from being private, right? Reflecting on the online, it's important to complicate our understanding of the public-private divide and of the idea of privacy itself. When we think of the home as private, we often talk of it in physical terms, but privacy is also fundamentally about the information and the agency to share information as we choose or not. In India, we are being asked to download an app that will facilitate tracking the individual ostensibly to enable contact tracing in relation to COVID. But when we live in a state that we certainly do not trust or desire to be visible to, what happens when our bodies are seen as data points? What kinds of boundaries can we frame, and in relation to whom we are visible to? Even as we think about our bodies as data points, raising concerns of privacy, we need to continue to reflect on the nature of the embodied self online. Further, the effort to digitally understand and pigeonhole the body, to fix us into slots, takes away from our capacity to become, to evolve, and to exercise agency about how we might see ourselves and our bodies at different moments. And this is important because just weeks before the Citizenship Act was passed, the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Bill became an act in November 2019, which among other things, and there are many, many which I will not dwell on right now, but took away trans people's right to self-identify. What happens when the gendered body is sought to be located statically? How do we engage when the state refuses us the right to present ourselves as we see ourselves at any given time? even as our protests are forced online. I think, and this is important, I think, to sort of assert that feminists, especially younger feminists, have very successfully engaged with and forged national and transnational movements, including those in relation to public space. In India and across the border, in Pakistan, feminist movements in the last 2 decades have built online communities through campaigns like Blank Noise, Girls at Dabas, and Pinjra Tod. All of these were claiming access to the public in different ways. They have built conversations across our very fraught borders and pushing our understanding of how both feminist activism might take place and how feminist communities might be formed and sustained. And I think it's important for us to think about this in this time when all of us are sort of, in a sense, sort of struggling to find the language of protest. Even as we continue to sustain these gains online, even as the public is cast as dangerous in a different way. And now this is it's very much in India, particularly about caste and about class. We must not lose sight of the gains we have made in the last 2 decades in access to the public. The idea of loitering, once marginal, even seen as problematic, is within feminist circles at least now taken for granted. I conclude with some questions that I'm grappling with. How, I wonder, in the face of the pandemic and state clampdowns, will we re-access the public, reclaim the streets for protest and pleasure, and build on the claims we have made in the last 2 decades to public space? What does it mean to be pushed inside and to think of the outside from the inside? What does the public mean in this context? What does it mean to be political in a pandemic? How do we reflect on the corporately owned platforms on which we are compelled to mount our political campaigns for freedom? What does it mean to have Twitter storms? What does it mean to be on Facebook or Instagram, which are owned by companies we know have very, very right-wing agendas? How might we think of feminist communities now? How might we build and sustain radical political movements? How might feminist solidarities be imagined in a pandemic? Thank you. Rashmi, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Okay. I was saying thank you once again, everyone, and particularly Shilpa, who's just presented her thoughts, for adding another layer of complexity and nuance to the discussions which have taken place. There are also some parallel discussions going on in chat, which are fascinating and which I hope we can bring to the larger discussion here on our main panel. So I've just been going through the questions, and a few of them I want to keep for the end, for the concluding remarks. But perhaps to just pick up from, you know, Shilpa, what you said and what I'm seeing Sarah talking about in the chat room here, which is this whole question, and all of you actually have addressed that. Asha has talked about that, Nida. Is this question of public-private, of home and the world, of the city and the domestic space, and the way in which the internet or online, you know, online relations are being forged, whether it's coming to, you know, comes to thinking about new ways of protesting, new ways of forging transnational solidarities and links. But also interestingly, when Sarah was talking about the fact that the family courts are not held virtually, you know, it made me think of, you know, the impact of the online within homes and on gender, you know, relations. What would it mean for a family court? Not being a lawyer, I'm really curious about that. How would that alter the ways in which we think of that divide? So perhaps if each of you could say just, you know, in a short response, respond to that question of the way in which the online space is mediating between the public-private divide. I mean, we've all talked about the unevenness of the digital divide and uneven access and so on. But Sarah in particular, if you can talk about the virtual family court? What would it look like? What would it mean for family relations? And also, you know, the rest of the panelists as well. What does the online, how does it intervene in that divide, the public-private divide?
Well, I mean, I think one of the issues is that, you know, the virtual court has been brought on for urgent matters. So we are not, all of the big backlogs, all of the normal cases, all are not going there. But in the non-online space, these maintenance cases are seen as the lowest of the low, the least important, the least prioritized, the ones that can be dragged out over decades and years and so on. So the reason, and no one obviously thought they were important to add in when the virtual court thing was being set up. There is an opportunity to push for it. The way they would make a difference is that, firstly, you can obviously get interim orders from there, which are important. Getting money in people's hand is absolutely important, particularly because although there are stimulus packages, these safety net expansions and all of that, it's just not enough for anyone to survive on. And that maintenance is critical to people's survival. I mean, in BLAS, for example, 80% or more of our clients are women, all of whom have a background history of domestic violence, but almost all of whom come for that maintenance to be insured so that they and their kids can survive. So I mean, if we re-envision it, rather than just saying, let's just activate the family courts, we could actually solve a really major problem, which is maintenance cases being treated as the lowest of the low, because they could be massively expedited. There's no reason for them to be dragged out, right? They're relatively simple things. They're almost formulaic. You can actually cut through them really, really swiftly if you want to. And we have had instances of people even doing that, you know, in physical offline courts when you've had proactive judges. So it could be, instead of being treated as the bottom of the heap, it could be treated as one of the things that can be solved by having an efficient online system. You could cut a lot of the problems, because the classic problem we have is that a woman will file a maintenance case. The guy will find some tiny procedural error to go off to the High Court and get it stayed forever. So now you can actually solve that deadlock really, really quickly. You don't need to have, you know, all the paperwork is much simpler. You don't have the usual, you can cut a lot of the corruption, because, you know, you don't have to have your bench officer saying, oh, you haven't given me 100 rupees, 100 tak, I'm not going to move your file from here to that desk and so on. So you could potentially cut all of that, but somebody has to decide it's important and it should be a higher priority than arresting a ship or getting some company matter resolved or whatever. So I think that would be one way to think about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Sorry.
Yeah, anyone else would like to come in and talk about, yeah, this kind of in-between space of the virtual world?
Just actually very, very briefly to add to what Sarah said, I'm a trustee of a legal feminist organization called Majlis. And one of the things they were saying is that they were anticipating that this pandemic will be used by men to reduce alimony, to say that they could no longer send child support, and precisely what Sarah is saying, that you don't get access then to the courts, and so when the money doesn't come in, it's much harder then to enforce it. So I just wanted to make that very brief point, that they are also anticipating exactly the kind of questions Sarah's raising.
Kavita, Nida, Asha, do you want to come in on this question?
I want to say something about this private public divide with regards to women who are working from home, specifically, I mean, for us in academia as well. So while it's a privilege definitely that we have hold on to a job so we can work from home, unlike daily wage earners, one of the things that has been coming up is the kind of the way in which time has become so elastic. There are meetings that are scheduled right through the day, because there is no travel time, and no one thinks about people needing breaks. So in academia especially, there are meetings that are called, you know, suddenly at 12 noon we are said there's another meeting in half an hour. Meetings that go on till 7 or 8 at night, which never happened. People went home by 4, 5 o'clock. So, and even in the corporate sector, I've been hearing again anecdotal evidence that time has become elastic, and women are expected to kind of, you know, they can't say they have work, they have to feed their children, it's time to cook dinner. that they have to be available on call, and also, this kind of making an excuse about housework is particularly gendered, right? So yeah, I just wanted to make that comment.
Nida, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, sorry, you were muted again.
Yeah,
So
sorry, I'm trying to preserve the bandwidth, and then I keep forgetting
that's
to.
totally fine.
Yeah.
I mean, I think with the online, like everyone's talked about, there's so many creative ways that it could be used, like what Sarah has mentioned. But we haven't seen it coming. It's in the Pakistani context, these kind of ways in which, for example, cases in family courts could be moved more quickly. What's happening is they're just using it as an excuse to shut everything down. And so that, what was a slow process before is now just stopped altogether. I'm curious to think about more like later on to reflect on what this online time meant for all of us. I know in terms of organizing, it can be very frustrating. Feminist groups I'm involved in. It's great, we have these wonderful meetings on Zoom, but now I think we're all zoomed out, whether you're, whatever you're organizing for, it's very difficult to sit in these meetings for 3 hours, 2 hours every day, whether it's work or whether it's for political activism. So while it's great that we can all sit like this and talk across borders, and it has these severe limitations. So I look forward to the time when we can actually start doing face-to-face organizing and protests again, because I really think that our respective governments are taking full advantage of the fact that the risk of folks being out on the streets in the same numbers as they were before the pandemic is just so much lower, because so many of us are bound to our homes. And how much impact can a webinar, and no, I mean, I organize webinars, they're wonderful, but in terms of the threat to the power structure, how much threat will these online forms of activism or discussions actually pose for the powers that be? And I really think that, at least in our context, but probably in all of the countries we're talking about, the governments know that, and that's why they're using this to their full advantage, the pandemic. So it's wonderful. I'd love to hear more also from Kavita about more creative or community-centered solutions to, this has opened up a space for all of us to imagine a different kind of way of organizing social relations, our homes, the economy. But it's also, we need to move to what those solutions might look like. And I want to learn from everyone here about what that might look like.
Yeah, thank you. Although it was really a wonderful moment to see how Trump's meeting had been sabotaged by all the young people who, did this online thing of preventing tickets being sold for it. Yeah, Kavita, do you want to come in on this? Yeah.
Yes, I won't come in on the online thing because I think a lot of points have been made there very well, and I couldn't hear the last speakers completely. I wanted to just elaborate on one point which Nida last mentioned about my presentation, which is basically that I really think that a feminist-led rethinking about how we would respond, what would a democratic response to a pandemic look like? That is something which requires a far more amplified conversation, far wider conversation. And I think it's a good time to do that, which means what? Briefly, what do I mean by that? I mean that, basically what we see, the Chinese lockdown, and then that being the model here, certainly. And it was almost a sort of dress rehearsal for a counterinsurgency. In the Indian case, it meant that basically, random violence. So the violence of the police against the poor became, they just got a completely free hand to indulge that violence. And that didn't help to spread the virus. And it also was an extremely, so you had as many, you had a huge number of lockdown related deaths, not to mention the COVID-19 deaths. And of course, women were at the receiving end of a lot of this. And in contrast to that, something which I want to highlight, we talk a lot about domestic violence, and all that is quite valid. But at the same time, what we saw in India, which moved me terribly, was that suddenly we had, the invisible, for the large part, media would keep migrant workers invisible, right? And suddenly you had this extremely precarious population, people being seen, forcing themselves into people's eyesight and view as human beings. So you had, this man who, you had these men carrying.
I think her connection. Okay, I think while we wait for Kavita's connection to be back, maybe I could turn to one of the questions that a couple of panelists have posed, and that has to do with women's health, both in terms of, becoming directly afflicted with COVID-19 and their particular vulnerabilities, but also the, situation as it's evolving in terms of, intensification of violence, in terms of the migrant women who are having to leave cities, their situation. I think someone's asked a question about menstruating women and menstruation and reproductive health during the time of the pandemic. So is that something that, Kavita is back, hopefully, but while we are getting connected.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. It suddenly got disconnected on so.
Okay.
I'll quickly end.
Okay, yeah. Why don't you finish and then we can.
Yeah, I'll just quickly finish. Yeah. So I was just saying that basically the reimagining.
It's the.
Democratic response, understand why masks or distancing is necessary. Don't do that, and rather you trust people with information, you trust people to make decisions, you trust people to help each other when they are ill or in quarantine and all of that. A response that looks like that, something to explore.
Have we lost her again? It seems. So maybe I'll send her a message that, we're on to the question of health, and then she can come back. So would maybe a couple of people want to respond to that question on our panel? Anyone?
Just because nobody else has stepped in, I don't actually have anything very profound to add in relation to health, but there is a story that's worth telling in relation to menstruating women, because in the absence of the state in many ways, and I speak particularly about Mumbai because I know much less about what's happening elsewhere, though I'm reading reports, but Mumbai, I'm on WhatsApp groups, I have friends who are running NGOs and so the NGOs are really picking up the slack of providing basic necessities where the state has failed to do so, and sort of citizens across the board are donating money. But there's one group, that's the one initiative that's worth talking about. They call themselves the PAD Squad, and they are collecting sanitary napkins to distribute to women. So basically they ask not that you donate money, but that you online you buy sanitary towels and have them shipped to their addresses, and then they take these and they go around settlements where they think that women can't afford sanitary towels, and they are distributing them. And I think it's an interesting and thoughtful initiative that's worth talking about in some ways.
Yeah. Anyone else wants to come in on the question of women's health? Okay, there's another question on Dalit women, and I was wondering if we could actually expand it to the question of community that Kavita raised, in her discussion, which is that, one kind of alternative to a state-led lockdown could be a community-led, sort of organizing of dealing with the virus. But at the same time, not only in India, where we've seen cases of attacks on Muslims and this being called the Muslim virus, in our previous webinar, we had someone from Pakistan who talked about the kind of discrimination going on against minority communities in Pakistan. Similarly, in Sri Lanka, Malati Dialvis talked about, the Islamophobia in Sri Lanka. So I'm wondering, whether we as feminists, where do we turn to for our sort of organizing, the sort of usual state versus community, dilemma, but particularly in this moment, how do we think of community when the community itself has been fragmented and under strain is fragmented even more? So if anyone wants to come in on that, I would be very interested in that, because I was really struck by that if our communities, are rife with issues of caste and religion and, those kinds of differences, how do we organize, via our communities, a kind of response to the state lockdown? And also the neighborhood as a space. I've heard lots of interesting stories about people who live in multi-story buildings, and what's been going on there, of course, in the slum areas and so on. So, yeah, if you could all reflect on this issue of communities in this time of the pandemic. Who constitutes a community for us?
Can I comment on that? Yeah. So in the early weeks of the curfew in Sri Lanka, I think there were lots of middle-class homes, upper middle-class homes, and we were quite concerned about, so there are sort of two camps, I suppose. There were some who were very concerned about what was happening with their domestic workers. And so they were trying to get curfew passes to go drop off either money or supplies to their domestic workers, because they knew that they may not have access to the trucks that were coming into more kind of affluent neighborhoods. And that was a real struggle, because the police were like, a lockdown is a lockdown. Like you cannot go through. Like, we don't know whether the person's doing well. We've got calls that they have young children, they don't have access. And there was, the whole kind of initiative to try to help people were sort of completely policed and said, look, this is not the time to do this. The government is helping, the army is helping, the army will distribute goods. So it was, all of these things were kind of challenged, whatever communal feelings that we had. But on the other hand, I mean, to go back to domestic workers themselves, I mean, caste issues in Sri Lanka are muted. They don't get sort of overtly discussed, but there are definitely caste issues, and definitely class and caste play sort of a role. And again, so when work was sort of opened up, one of the biggest silences that I noticed is, and some of us who had worked on a research on domestic workers just like literally weeks before the shutdown, appealed to the ILO and other people to send some kind of directive about how do we pay for people who are now at home. Is there some kind of minimum amount that we should be paying? Because people, like, if they're not coming to work, why should we pay? Whereas other people were kind of like, look, we need to do something. They're without an income. So there was absolute silence both from the state and the sort of INGO sectors about sort of issuing any kind of statement. And then, of course, when we opened up in the end of May, there was a real fear that these poor people coming back from more infected areas were then going to be, the vectors of this disease, where, and we had controlled it so well. And that was a real sort of discussion, fear about bringing domestic workers back into the home and what kinds of, and I mean, again, the state could have intervened and had certain, just as they issued protocols for everything, they could have said, look, you have to have these protocols, they come in, they change, you have to wash your hands. All of these things could have been addressed, but it was left to kind of households to figure out, and people kind of voiced the fears of kind of people who were less hygienic coming into the house. So that was quite disturbing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Nida?
Yeah, I think just to pick up on that, I think that's one of the things that we're seeing here as well, is this kind of myth that this is somehow being transmitted more by people who are from working class or poor backgrounds. And we know in any context that the virus does not discriminate based on class. And if anything, what I've noticed is it's the more kind of posh localities for some reason, maybe it's because they're getting tested more or whatever, that we're hearing the largest numbers of cases coming from. But anyway, so I think that the concern is that this is going to exacerbate all of those inequalities spatially and socially that we saw in our cities before, that Shilpa has also written extensively about. And that's what we see, is that, some parts of the city are locked down, like where I'm sitting right now, which is called the Defense Housing Authority. And people are out and about, but certainly not at the same level as they would be during non-pandemic time. But there's other parts of the city where I do my research, Liadi, which is a more working class area, which I've talked to my friends there, and they say you can't even tell there's really no difference. But that means the folks there are probably just staying within their area. So I think the social spatial divides are also probably growing quite a bit, and this kind of class anxiety is being exacerbated. I think the point that Kavita made about community-led is really important, and I think even it's pushed me to think about asking for a lockdown and the state should come down hard, and what does lockdown mean? The problem, and can there be a more feminist, community-led way of actually caring for each other and stopping the spread of this virus that's not authoritarian in nature, that doesn't give the police more power than they already do? The problem, I think, with many of our contexts, Pakistan, from the start, there's been so much misinformation about this virus that nobody actually believes that it's a thing here. So, we would have to just start from that. There would have to be a massive public education campaign. We would need the state to step in and do that kind of education work that they're not doing. We had our prime minister saying for a very long time that this is just like the flu, that young people can get it. I mean, saying these things on television, and now 2 days ago, we had a poll that came out that said 55% of people polled said that they thought this was exaggerated, that there's not really any really real threat of COVID. So there's going to be so much work that would need to be done in terms of education. But I agree that's what we should be working towards, so that we are not asking the police to come and stop people and put people away and, charge with their lathis or whatever that we do see happening in our region. But yeah, so that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, actually there's a related question which has come via email, and perhaps Shilpa, Sarah, and Kavita, I hope she's still listening in, could respond to that, which is a question that have there been any mutual aid initiatives crossing class lines? And to what extent has this been gendered? This person recalls the comment about WhatsApp neighborhood groups and provision trucks. And it feeds into the community question that I was asking. So I think Asha gave one example of the ways in which middle class and upper middle class homes, rallied around, I guess, to supposedly provide aid to or help to their domestic workers, but it was very, very unregulated and problematic. And I think recently I read reports that actually it was a very small percentage of domestic workers who had received any pay through the time of this pandemic. I think it was an India-wide study. I don't know how deep it was. So I think this question, as they're saying, is kind of building on that question of this whole idea of mutual aid cutting across class and gender lines that we have seen through these different kinds of groups coming up.
I mean, I think
yeah, Sarah.
Let me jump in quickly. I think there's a number of different things.
Okay.
We have obviously seen formal NGOs doing a lot of this in Bangladesh, from the giant ones like BRAC to very small ones like Jago Foundation, a small group that works with kids in informal schools. And they've really developed their own programs, but also collaborated quite a lot with local government in ensuring distribution. Another thing was, again, not exactly a mutual aid society, but again, getting the right people into the relief programs. I mentioned earlier that a lot of corruption was reported in terms of relief distribution, with some of the people reporting on that, of course, then facing arrest and harassment. But getting, for example, we had colleagues in Blast who made sure that some of the Hijra groups in their district who had been left out, although they were identified as a priority group, they got lists of names into the DC's office and then got them in. That was another way. But in addition, there have been all sorts of, I think what you're getting at is these very informal groupings. So we've been part of a group of academics, activists, professionals who have really supported getting individuals to get medical assistance. I had an experience this week with a very senior lawyer who's one of our foremost sort of public interest lawyers, who suddenly reported as being hospitalized with corona and needed a plasma donation. So this group just worked online for about 2 days, reaching out to everybody, and was able to get that donation across to him. And I think the point is, in our context anyway, our health system is not exactly available to everybody. You have to leverage personal contacts to get your urgent appointment or get to a particular service or a particular doctor, a particular hospital anyway. So these kinds of groups are at least helping for some people when they can. So this is just one example I'm giving, so to make some kind of difference.
Yes, thank you. Shilpa or Kavita, would you want to respond? Kavita, would you? I don't know whether she can.
Yeah, I'd like to, if you can.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes? Okay, yes. So I'll try to, I did want to say something about that, because on the lines that Sarah is saying, I would say that, in the first month, and in fact, almost 2 months of the lockdown, there was very little government aid happening at all. And it was a complete mess, and especially for the migrant workers, as well as for rural communities, very poor communities who were suddenly left jobless. There was an immense sort of crisis of hunger and aid of all kinds. And migrant workers were, they were locked up, by employers in places, not allowed to leave, etc. And of course, you're absolutely right that many of them, migrant workers were not paid wages, and a lot of domestic workers were also not paid wages, and so on. But at the same time, I would say that essentially those who stepped into that void were, of course, trade unions and various people's movement organizations, as well as some NGOs and all of that, but also
connection.
testify to the fact that the food in Bangalore, for instance, I've had my trade union comrades tell me about corporate lawyer friends who would sort of drop whatever they were doing and get out in their car and sort of use their relative privilege to make sure that they were going around providing bags of rations and so on to people, going and trying to free workers and all of that. Same thing in Bombay also. There were a lot of instances of that kind of people making available their cars, making available their homes, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to say that, of course, I'm not trying to generalize and say that, oh, cross-class, whatever, but I'm just wanting to say that there was a lot of civil society. So just to preserve bandwidth.
Thank you, Kavita. I think there was a little bit of a blip at the end, but yeah, thank you for your input into that. Unfortunately, I think I have to act like one of those proverbial infamous anchors and say that we are running out of time, and perhaps to give each of you a minute or so to just wrap up and to, I guess, one of the questions that many people have asked has been about the future, feminist futures after the pandemic. And you have 60 seconds to respond to that question. Is when we come out on the other side, is it going to be more hopeful for feminist futures, or are we just seeing greater consolidation of power across gender lines as already exists? So I'm going to start with Shilpa and then reverse the order in which we started.
Okay, I'm going to try and stay in those 60 seconds. It's a really, really big question, and I'm not quite sure where to begin to respond to, because one is always hopeful at one level that one will be able to retrieve the gains one has made, that one will be able to go back to a world where one can claim citizenship. But we're facing not just the pandemic, but we are facing alongside it the push back from a whole lot of right-wing agendas. And I want to sort of just flag again, I mean, I'm in some ways ending with questions, but to flag what Kavita said about thinking about a feminist response or a feminist communitarian response to a pandemic and how it might focus on care. And I think one important thing that has come out of this pandemic is this issue of care in relation to mental health, in relation to labor, in relation to emotional labor. These are questions that are being asked, and it's a discourse that's entered the mainstream. And I think that's something important. I mean, I think that some kind of push forward has been made. I also wanted to sort of flag, and this I think is something that is so obvious that perhaps none of us mentioned it, that it seems to be, and this is the data that has emerged, that women-led countries, not just feminist, but even just women-led countries seem to have done way, way better than others, than particularly those led by men. And to conclude, I want to just sort of recount or just list the countries with the maximum number of cases: the United States, Brazil, Russia, India, and Britain. And we just need to think about who leads them. The comparison is so telling that one need not say anything else.
Thank you, Shilpa. Thank you so much for that, for reminding us of that. Kavita, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Okay, so
yes, I'll just make one last point, which is not such a very hopeful point, but I just want to say this. See, in India, for the immediate future, as Shilpa rightly said, partly.
Try switching off your video, Kavita, and using only audio.
Terrible political dismantle labor laws in the name of rebuilding the economy. And the impact of that on women is going to be completely awful. And I just wanted to recount one little example there and end with that, which is, that we have this prominent journalist here and commentator, Shekhar Gupta, and he did this, editorial show on the loosening of the labor laws and hailing it, saying, oh, how wonderful it is. You should make use of the crisis, and this is great. And then he gave an example where he breezily said that, oh, they've dismantled all other labor laws, but I think, they've exempted maternity leave, and, oh, don't worry, I'm sure they will. There's no clarity there, but I'm sure they won't dismantle. And I felt like laughing out loud, because I said, you're taking away the primary labor law that you're dismantling is the right to organize. And we all know that labor laws can be enforced only if you are organizing and fighting. If you don't fight, then the labor law is going to remain on paper and die there. So the very fact that the right to organize itself and the right to protest in general in India is under such an attack. You have wonderful feminist activists and friends like Sudha Bharadwaj, as well as all these younger feminist activists in jail right now. So it's a very grim situation and very difficult right now to feel particularly hopeful. I can only say that we sort of, need to remember that I look at it this way. I think that if you have a future that you're fighting for, no matter what your situation is, it must be an offensive fight, not a defensive one. And if you have that as a compass guiding you in a way, then your everyday fights also sort of become that much easier. You're able to take it.
Okay, thank you, Kavita. That was very, very energizing, as was to be expected from you. Now, Nida, do you want to just wrap up your?
Sure, I'll just take a few seconds. It's hard to follow Kavita's. We needed some energizing words, and I think I'm in a particularly having one of those hopeless days during the pandemic that we all have, and kind of go up and down emotionally. But I think in terms of Pakistan, I don't feel very hopeful at this moment right now, in terms of any major change happening anytime soon during the pandemic or after. But I think what, like for all places, the pandemic is exposing is the vast inequality and the unjust nature of our economy, especially. And just now the budget came out in Pakistan, and the military gave themselves another, well, I say they gave themselves, the government gave it to the military, but we know that the military gave it to themselves, 12% more of the budget during the pandemic, and health is still just 1% of the total budget. So, when you hear things like this, it's hard to feel hopeful. But one thing we can at least, as people who are academics and who are trying to organize for some kind of change, is to really make a lot of noise about this. And I think people have been doing that and expose the unjust nature of this kind of setup and the incompetence of our governments. And I think Shilpa mentioned India having one of the highest rates. Pakistan is right up there in the same category. We also have a kind of populist government that is very much just a puppet of the military. And so what one hopes is that after this is over, we can build on those lessons that we've learned, those harsh lessons, and organize for a more just kind of feminist future.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Nida. I guess we have to find hope even from the worst situations possible, because that's the only way to go. Sarah, would you want to?
I agree with Kavita. I think, you have to fight for the future, but I just want to add a little caveat to Shilpa's enthusiasm about women leaders. I really find it a bit difficult to subscribe to that. Maybe you need to live under one again and realize it's not that rosy, actually. It's more, I think it's more than about being women and men. I mean, the list of, women leaders who've been successful have also been those in democratic states where there's people's participation and voice, and you can experience offline organizing and online organizing without fear of incarceration. But I think the space for hope, I think, is that even with all of these restrictions and all forms of repression and so on, that actually just the fact we're having this conversation, I think in the last 10 years, we've seen such a reduction in our cross-regional conversations precisely because of these authoritarians that we have in place, who are very happy to meet themselves and have their corporate cronies meet in every possible avenue, but don't let actually civil society, feminist voices and rights activists gather. So I think that's a space that, this COVID has made that possible, and has made it possible for us to hear each other's voices again. And I think the other thing that has been really encouraging, that even with all of the problems and massive problems that we face, the communication across class, like people speaking around workers' rights, finding ways to use technology to have those conversations, but also take the little bit of public space that we still have to do that. I think that is a space and an opportunity. And I think I want to end just by, I find it very hard, to be overly optimistic in any case, given what we all live in. But I think the fact we've been able to speak about the activists who are incarcerated, I think if we could take that as a step from this conversation, that we could come together to actually take one action, which is to speak about, about Subha Bhardwaj, about Siraj and Munira in Bangladesh and others, and we could just have a common South Asian feminist statement about them, not just the women, but the male activists who are incarcerated at the moment. I think that would be like a real blow to getting us in the direction we want to go in after all of this is over. And thanks again, Rashmi, for giving us this chance to be together.
That's a fantastic and a very concrete idea, and hopefully we will take this forward. Asha, over to you.
Thanks, Rashmi. So I'm going to be a little hopeful by sharing a conversation or a series of conversations I happened to have during the lockdown. I was doing some research, which then sort of quickly transformed to over the phone research. And I happened to be talking to about 27 women's rights organizations, across the country. I was doing an assessment of sorts, trying to figure out the kind of spaces they have to do, the work that they really want to do, and what sort of defined them when they started off, and then sort of what the kind of donor spaces made them do. But one of the things they were talking about is that many of them were the first organizations that the Grama Sevaka or the state authorities or even sort of national NGOs had approached to distribute goods because they have such a good relationship and networks within the community. So they were quite sort of proud that they were the people who were actually approached to do the work, and it kind of demonstrated that they had good connections that they had built over the years by working in the communities. And I felt that was kind of, this was coming across, and this was not even part of the assessment. We were just chatting about what's going on during the sort of lockdown, and periodic, lots of them talked about this. But to add a caveat to that, as part of the assessment, one of the things they were talking about is that they can kind of anticipate now all the sort of national level, international researchers approaching them because they're the ones with information now to enable research into the pandemic and its repercussions. And they were really quite fearful that they would be exploited again, that they would just be used as data gatherers and they would not have the power to, or the agency with which to kind of design interventions that actually spoke to the communities. So I'll stop there.
I keep forgetting to do that. I have a lot to learn about Zoom seminars, but I just want to conclude by thanking all of you for taking time out. As Nida said, we are all Zoomed out in so many different ways. and time seems to have really, changed its capacity to, sort out our days and our work and so on. But I've really learned from each one of you today, and I'm sure our audience has also learned a lot. And I hope we can find ways of keeping up this dialogue. Sarah had a very concrete suggestion to make about doing some kind of a letter for our people in jail who've been political dissenters, feminist activists, and that is something, that perhaps we could take forward from here. But thank you once again. We will share the recording with you, so if you want to share it with other people, that would be wonderful. And hope to see all of you again, and hopefully face to face at some point soon. So thank you for your time. And thank you to everybody who signed up and who tuned in. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rashmi.
Yeah.
Rashmi, thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.